Starting out with the second negative constructive, then moving on to the first negative rebuttal, and showing you how the affirmative team's plan is indeed still warrants a change in today's debate round. I'd like to start off with the first issue presented by the second negative speaker. He talked about topicality, how our plan, how under the Constitution, under our interpretation, the government shouldn't have constitutional power to enact environmental policy. Now, he tried to say that we're not topical because of this. But, Judge, in the real world, the government is exercising environmental policy. In the real world, it is exercising what's not in the Constitution. So we can change what the government is currently doing. We're not violating the resolution in any way with our plan. Now, the next point they brought up was that they said that we're going to be giving Congress the power to force the Supreme Court into accepting our plan, which is tyrannical. But, Judge, that's not exactly what we do. What we do is we use Congress to enact the law, and we use the Supreme Court to interpret it so that it is considered to be constitutional. We're not using Congress to force the Supreme Court in any way. And I'll be addressing the fiat issue later, showing you how we actually do have legitimate use of fiat power in today's debate round, why this is legitimate. Now, the next argument they brought up a piece of evidence from Michael Ferris saying how the Constitution is supreme. Now, we would agree the Constitution is supreme. And in the 1930s, Congress went away from what the Constitution said, that all legislative power should be vested in Congress, and they started allowing delegation to perpetrate within the government. And so we believe that we should go back to this intent, back to the original intent of the Constitution and reinterpret the Constitution. Now, the next argument they brought up, talking about their counterplan. Now, Judge, it's important in today's debate round that they prove that their counterplan is indeed mutually exclusive. Because if it's not, then they have not fulfilled all the criterion for a counterplan in today's debate round. Now, look at their counterplan. What they do is they enact two constitutional amendments. They're trying to say that their counterplan is mutually exclusive from our counterplan because we're using Congress to pass the law, and somehow that makes the two plans not be able to coexist. But, Judge, that doesn't really make sense, because you can use Congress to enact our law, you can use the Supreme Court to interpret it such a way, and then you can pass constitutional amendments also afterwards, barring all delegated rulemaking. There's no logical reason why the two plans cannot coexist in today's debate round. So therefore, you should not vote for the negative team in today's debate round. Now, the next argument they brought up, the disadvantage, the Nancy Pelosi disadvantage. What they said basically, we shouldn't be allowing people like people in Congress to interpret, to pass the laws and interpret the Constitution. Now, my response to this is that this disadvantage potentially applies to their counterplan, so you should reject it also. Now, I'd like to move on to the first negative rebuttal. They talked about the separation of powers, how our plan is not respecting the separation of powers, but that's exactly what our plan does. We use the proper executive agencies to reinterpret the Constitution and for Congress to enact legislation within constitutional parameters. We're not violating the separation of powers in any way with our plan. Now, the next argument they brought up, they said that only a constitutional amendment can change the delegation process because it's unclear. But the problem is, Judge, in the 1930s, we went away from the original interpretation of the Constitution, and that's a problem because we added power without a constitutional amendment. I'd like to read this piece of evidence from Dr. Robert A. Levy in April 19, 2003, quote, "The President and Congress can proceed only from constitutional authority, not from good intentions alone. If Congress thinks it's necessary to expand its powers, the framers crafted an amendment process for that purpose," end quote. So we see that in the 1930s, the Supreme Court used an unconstitutional method of increasing the federal government's power. And so because the original expansion of government power was unconstitutional, we do not need an amendment to restrict the power. We can just go back to the proper constitutional interpretation of the Constitution, which is what our plan does. Now, the next argument presented by the negative team, talking about the fiat. We cannot fiat the courts because the resolution is only talking about policy, and the courts are not a policy maker. But, Judge, the courts in the real world today do actually practice policy. In 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA was mandated to regulate CO2 if they found it to be dangerous in contributing to global warming. This is a clear example of how the Supreme Court is indeed enacting policy in today's debate round. In the way the federal government works in the current system, the Supreme Court does actually use its power to enact laws and policy on the American people. So we can, in fact, fiat the Supreme Court is truly legitimate. Also, the resolution says that we should use the federal government to change environmental policy. The Supreme Court is clearly one of the branches of the federal government. It's the part of the judicial branch. So we have fiat power over the Supreme Court to enact our plan. Now, the next argument presented by the negative speaker, talking about the James Madison evidence. They said that was not talking about delegation, but, Judge, what's happened in the current system is we have allowed executive agencies to make laws. That is clearly against the words of James Madison, the original intent of the Constitution. Thank you.